Aua wairea te tapu ka hura tangata uta te turaki atu ki tangata atai. Ka hura tangata atai te turaki atu ki tangata uta. Pērā hoki rā te kōrepe nui, te kōrepe roa, te wāhia wa te toi toi awa. Whakamaua tama ki te ara, whakamoe tama ki te ara, no tuhu norongo. Whano, whano, hara mai te toki. Haumi e, hui e, tāiki. Tēnā tātou, e mihi ake ana ki te wā hingaro, te tīmatanga me te whakaotinga o ngā mea katoa. Koutou rā, tātou hunga mate, mai ana ki ngā marae, huri noi te motu, haere, haere, whakangaro atu, hoki mai no rā ngā rārangi kōrero kia tātou, e pai nei ki te poho o tēnei whare kōrero, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Infants, Children and the Covid-19 Vaccine. My name is Kauti Wakeford and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our team. Today's webinar is hosted by a Better Start National Science Challenge, Cure Kids and the Paediatric Society of New Zealand. A Better Start is a national science challenge working to help children, teenagers and their whānau achieve the best possible start in life. Its mission is to find practical, evidence-based solutions that make a measurable difference for tamariki, improving the potential for all young New Zealanders to have a healthy weight, good literacy skills and sound mental health. Cure Kids is the largest charitable funder of child's health research in New Zealand. Its mission is to enable research to transform the health of children in New Zealand and the Pacific. The Paediatric Society of New Zealand is a not-for-profit charitable organisation that works collaboratively with other societies, government departments and institutions with similar goals to create a better New Zealand for tamariki and rangatahi. Today, you'll hear from Professor Peter McIntyre and Professor Claire Breen about the latest paediatric COVID-19 research and the children's rights and consenting. Before we start our webinar, a little housekeeping. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, including Q&A. All audience members will be automatically muted throughout the session. A recording of today's webinar will be made available to all attendees, and there will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar today. Hopefully we have time. Please submit these questions using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please just reiterating, not the chat function that we're all probably used to using, but the Q&A function at the bottom of your window. Our chairs for today are Associate Professor Collin Tukuitonga, tēnā koe e kara, who is board member for a Better Start National Science Challenge, the Associate Dean Pacific at the University of Auckland and Associate Professor of Public Health. He is our Ministry of Health's Technical Advisory Group for COVID-19 and is assisting the Auckland Regional Public Health Service to manage the current outbreak. Dr. Matire Harwood, who is an associate professor in the Department of General Practice and Primary Care at the University of Auckland and works as a GP at the Papakura Marae Health Clinic. And I believe as a whanaunga from Te Taitokero, e te whaia tēnā koe. She is a member of the steering group tasked with deciding who will govern the interim Māori Health Authority. So e akuranga tira, tēnā korua o tira, tēnā koutou. Welcome to you both. And yeah, I'll hand the rākau kōrero over to you, e te matua e Collin. Take it away.
Kia ora, and thank you for that, Kawiti. Let me welcome you all as well. It's a pleasure to be part of today's panel's discussion. We have two exciting, well-qualified speakers who will start us off. I mean, obviously, people are concerned about COVID-19 and what it might do, and I'm unsure myself how things will pan out, given that in Auckland we are now at level 3 and there's still quite a number of new cases being reported every day. Obviously, the well-being of children becomes very acute as families grapple with vaccination, whether to vaccinate or not, risks and benefits, and of course the issue of consent. So we're very fortunate to have Peter McIntyre and Claire Breen speak with us today. So let me invite Professor Peter McIntyre to start. Peter is a professor in the Department of Women's and Children's Health in the University of Otago and a medical advisor for the Immunisation Advisory Centre at the University of Auckland. He's been a member of the World Health Organization's Strategic Advisory Group of Experts in Immunisation and a member of the COVID-19 Vaccine Technical Group that Kawiti referred to earlier for the Ministry of Health. From 2004 to 17, he was Director of Australia's National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance of Vaccine Preventable Diseases. His research relates to a wide range of vaccines and vaccine preventable disease topics, particularly pertussis and pneumococcal disease. We will keep the questions until Professor Breen has completed her presentation. So I would now like to invite Peter to share his presentation with us. Professor McIntyre, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much, Colin. And Colin's already warned me that he'll be pressing the mute button at 20 minutes. So I'll have to make sure that we get through what we need to get through in the time we have. So just kicking off then, I guess we all know we've been deltaed, as Colin was just saying, particularly in Auckland. Everyone's very well aware of this. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just saying, well, what does COVID look like in children, both severe disease and long COVID? Then I'm going to talk about the vaccines, and particularly vaccine safety, because that's always very important in children, arguably even more so than in adults. And then finish up talking about, well, if COVID is less severe in kids, why is that? Okay, I'm just trying to advance the slides here. Is that, oh, here we go. Okay, so Delta is a whole new virus, as we know. And one of the key things about Delta, as shown on this slide, is that it's just so much more infectious on a sort of scale here than flu or the original Wuhan strain, and in fact it's not too far off chickenpox. Now this is some data from New South Wales, where, as we know, there's now 30,000 cases or so of a Delta outbreak, and you can see here compared to what was going on in earlier waves of COVID in New South Wales, and I think this is not too dissimilar to New Zealand, there are a lot more cases in children and young people. And this is also reflected in the experience with the Auckland outbreak, where particularly in this 5 to 19-year-old age group, there have been a number of cases, and of course particularly affecting the Pasifika community. So how severe is COVID in children? Well, this is again using the much bigger data set in New South Wales to show how the proportion of cases by age group compares to the population. And the important thing to note here is that although there are lots and lots of cases, only 5% of children have been hospitalised. And in fact, particularly in the under 5 age group, about 80% of those are because of the parents, not because of the child. Very few children requiring intensive care, and no deaths despite more than 30,000 cases in New South Wales. And how does this compare with flu? Well, I'm sorry, I'm using some Australian data here as well, but just to illustrate the point that if you look at influenza hospitalizations, you can see that they're very, very prominent in the under 2s, with much lower hospitalisation rates, even compared to the over 65s in terms of a rate than what we're seeing in COVID. This is some US data showing much the same thing, comparing, this is the 12 to 17-year-old, adolescent age group, where there's lower hospitalizations for flu, but COVID clearly knocks that out of the park. And in particular, deaths are very rare in children. So that very severe end of the age spectrum really only seems to be an issue for children with severe multiple comorbidities as shown in this slide. So this is a slightly complex slide from the UK, where obviously there have been a large number of cases. And this red line here is if there was no difference between children with and without comorbidities. And you can see that particularly for this group with life-limiting comorbidity or multiple comorbidities in many systems, then the odds of hospitalisation are a lot higher, and this is reflected in the figures over here on the right as well. And in fact, really, ICU admission, death, and admission in general during COVID in the UK has predominantly been these children. Now, there is a lot of interest as well in the long COVID issue. And of course, long COVID or prolonged symptoms from COVID is not too surprising if you've had severe organ impairment, been admitted to intensive care, had ARDS, etc. But what we're really interested in children, of course, is, can you get long COVID in the absence of severe disease requiring hospitalisation? And there's a very recent review of all the studies of long COVID summarised over here that actually had control subjects. So they had controls, either children who were seropositive but didn't actually get recognised as symptomatic cases, or just children who had other kinds of viral infection. And you can see that when you look at data for persisting symptoms, comparing COVID cases with control cases, then actually they're very close, suggesting that probably there's not a whole lot extra happening in terms of long symptoms with COVID compared to other viruses. Perhaps a little bit, but certainly not at the kind of alarming levels that we've seen in some press reports. And of course, something where COVID has particularly been impactful for children overseas has been on their schooling. And in England recently, over 1 million children were out of school, and in fact, most of them were out of school because of contact with the case, not because they themselves were a case. So schooling and the importance of that has been a major issue. But the thing we need to remember, and something I'll come back to at the end, is if we want to protect children in school, we need to primarily ensure that both parents and teachers are vaccinated. That is the primary responsibility. And this is reflected in some of the recommendations around the world. New Zealand, in fact, was right up there with early registration of the vaccine for the 12 to 15-year-olds, and of course has been one of the first countries to include that group in its recommendation. The UK has recently changed from this risk-only process to a broader one, and in both Canada and the US, there are well-progressed programs with many millions of young adolescents who've received vaccine, and of course also in Israel, which we've heard a lot about, and which relates to the talk on consent, where they have certainly endorsed that for children. So the key issues in the time remaining that I want to focus on is the direct benefits to children. Is there indirect benefit to the rest of society from children being vaccinated in terms of reducing transmission? And what about vaccine safety? And as I mentioned, one of the issues with actual direct consequences to children is the fact that many hospitalizations are incidental, not actually due to COVID, and that comorbidities really very significantly relate to the risk of admission. There's also the multi-inflammatory syndrome, which we're all very aware of as rare, severe Kawasaki-like, but importantly, at the moment, we don't actually have evidence that is prevented by vaccination, although I guess we would hope that it would be. And in fact, Michael Levin, who's an expert on this area, as some of you may know, is he said exactly what distinguishes children with multi-inflammatory syndrome from other children is completely unknown. Now, moving on to the vaccine trial, some very promising results on really quite a small number of enrolled children, only a couple of thousand, 100% efficacy in preventing infection in this age group, and actually antibody levels which were about 1.5 times higher than even the 16 to 25 young adult age group. And so it's more immunogenic, and we're used to seeing that. We saw that with HPV, we saw that with hepatitis B vaccine, more immunogenic in this youngest age group. And interestingly, the only other vaccine for which there's published data is the Chinese inactivated vaccine, which had much lower antibody levels than the Pfizer publication, but similar across the age groups. And in fact, China's been using this vaccine in children over 3 for some time. Now, what about reducing transmission? Well, what we can say about that is the index case in a household is still much more likely to be a parent or an older child than a younger child, but if younger children are infected, they certainly can transmit. And so the question about, does vaccinating children somehow make herd immunity achievable even with Delta, I think is very questionable. I think what we've seen with Delta in terms of its infectiousness, including infection in people who've received vaccine, suggests that it will be very difficult to totally wipe out transmission. Even though we've got very important benefits in terms of reduced transmission, it's not going to go to zero. And the most recent data on this is a household transmission study from the UK, where it looked like the reduction in transmission, if you had a case in the household, was about 50%. So still very worthwhile, but not zero. So having looked at the benefits and I guess how well the vaccines work, and what we know about disease in children, very important to look at safety. And this is the data from the 12 to 15-year-old Pfizer trial. And without going through all these complicated looking bars over here, the key message was that it is quite a reactogenic vaccine. And remember, in this study, the full dose was given 3 weeks apart to these children. And in fact, over half of them reported headache or fatigue, but then interestingly enough, about 40% also did so for the placebo, but only 25% with dose 2. But I think a significant thing is fever and chills, which was actually pretty similar to the 16 to 25-year-olds, was much higher than the placebo group, so about 4 times higher, and about half required antipyretics. So a pretty significant issue that we need to be aware of in children who are receiving the vaccine. Right, whereas the Sinovac trial, had much lower rates of systemic reaction. Now, myocarditis, I'm going to flick through this because of shortage of time, but just to make this point that the myocarditis cases that have been reported and particularly been an issue in young adult males are in this sort of age group, really becoming much less common over the age of 50, and particularly occurring with dose 2. And I'm just going to flash through this as well too. This is the key point, I think, that although myocarditis is definitely an issue, I think it's been well established now that there is a definitely vaccine-associated syndrome of myocarditis, but 1 in 25,000 is still what we would classify as a rare side effect, and importantly, 1 in 500,000 requiring intensive care admission, and no evidence of ongoing, chronic cardiac problems. It seems to be an acute thing, which for the great majority of people can be managed with simple observation and symptomatic treatment. So I'll just thrust through this as well. So taking all this into account, the JCVI in the UK, their vaccine advisory group, came up with some benefit risk calculations. This is bearing in mind, what's happening with COVID in the UK at the moment. And so they estimate that for every million first doses, you can prevent 2 intensive care admissions and 87 hospital admissions in the UK, with a much larger population, obviously, than New Zealand. And you would get somewhere between 3 and 17 cases of myocarditis. And then for the second dose, they estimated that the extra ICU admissions and hospital admissions you were preventing were actually lower, but the number of myocarditis cases higher. And so that's led the UK to suggest that they would only go with 1 dose at this point in time and wait and see what happens in terms of recommending what happens with the second dose. And I think this is also an important message that that breakthrough infections are much less severe, but they can be infectious. And so we need to keep that in mind going forward with Delta, that we really get an impact on transmission, but it's not a silver bullet. Okay, now what about COVID-19 vaccines for children under 12? And in the US, it's been pointed out that, this was from probably more than 6 months ago, even close to 12 months ago, that the count with COVID-19 at that point in time for deaths in the whole US was around 100 children under 18, most of whom were older, of course. In fact, that's only through to September 2020, which was still more than you would typically see with things like varicella and rotavirus, for which children are being immunized, obviously, in the US and in New Zealand. And they were pointing out that it wasn't too far off influenza-associated deaths, for which the US has a comprehensive vaccination program. But it's still not in that same range, I guess, as we're seeing with older adults. And of course, as many of you will have seen in the news, Pfizer have very recently announced in a press release, although we don't actually have any published data on the 5 to 11-year-old trial, that as you would expect, you're getting very good antibody responses in younger children. But important to point out that Pfizer used a 1/3 dose, so 10 micrograms instead of 30 micrograms in the 5 to 11-year-old children, and were able to get very similar results. And even with this lower dose, they were still getting quite a few systemic side effects. So I think something we'll be keen to see is whether, in fact, this lower dose would also work in the 12 to 15-year-olds, if it works in 5 to 11-year-olds, and just where we land in terms of amount of vaccine and numbers of doses that we'll need. What do parents think? Well, this is a UK survey suggesting that probably about half of parents, particularly of secondary students, were keen on the idea, but there were a number that were kind of uncertain or opposed to vaccination. So I think there's a range of opinion from parents about this. And just to finish off, I just want to quickly overview what we know about, what's now well established, I think, that children do get less severe COVID. Why is that? And to cut a long story very short, it seems to be related to the fact that innate immunity in children is just much more efficient than it is even in young adults, certainly in older adults. And that seems to be partly due to innate lymphoid cells, which are known to decrease with age, especially in males, and that fits with what we see with what happens with severity of COVID. Greater neutrophil activity, and also more rapid interferon production. And interestingly, that doesn't happen in Down syndrome. Down syndrome children don't seem to be able to produce interferon in the same kind of way, and of course do have a higher risk of COVID. And then finally, how will SARS-CoV-2 behave, and how will it compare with seasonal coronaviruses circulating in children? And this is an interesting graph looking at the old seasonal ones, the ones that have been around for ages but we took no notice of, and comparing the IgM and IgG responses, showing that you get IgM in children, but in adults, so, you know, the sort of 10 and up sort of age group, you're getting frequent reinfections with these coronaviruses, but they're only causing IgG responses. And of course, what's happened with COVID is we haven't had that opportunity because everyone right up to, you know, 105 is naive to this infection. And so the question on this graph is saying, well, if you had something with an R0 of 6, so infectious like Delta, and it behaved like seasonal coronavirus, what would happen? And I guess the suggestion from this is that, in fact, you would get all these excess cases we're seeing here in the first couple of years, particularly in older age groups, but not in children, and you would ultimately end up with the virus circulating as a more tame seasonal coronavirus down the track. But of course, we're not certain about this, and we don't know how long it will take to happen. But nevertheless, that is the optimistic end of the scenario for children. So in summary, we're now talking about Delta. All around the world, we're talking about Delta, and definitely in New Zealand, we're talking about Delta. And Delta, because of its increased infectivity, is associated with more cases in children, despite the fact that it's definitely more severe in unimmunized adults. We're seeing higher ICU admissions, higher hospitalizations, even in young adults. We're not seeing that in children, even in places with lots of circulation. And the latest data on long COVID suggests that that's not a big issue in children either. As we know, we have the vaccine available in New Zealand now for anyone over 12, and there'll be data probably even younger than 5 years, not such a long time, but we need to be sure that we've got the right dose and we've got all the safety considerations in children worked out. And for that reason, I think we need to really focus on getting all the adults in contact with children vaccinated. So that's parents, that's teachers, that's carers, and of course, it's their grandparents. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. A lot of information there. Thank you. We, as I signaled at the beginning, we won't take any questions now. We'll go straight into our second presenter, Professor Claire Breen. Professor Breen is a professor of law at the Whare Wānanga o Waikato University. Her research focuses on children's legal rights, international human rights, and the socioeconomic aspects of international peace and security. She's published extensively in the area of children's rights. Professor Breen is a regular contributor to the conversation, and her articles have been republished both nationally and internationally. So, Professor Breen, the floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for your kind introduction. As Collin has said, my background is human rights law and children's rights law. And it's with that background in mind that I guess I'm delivering my remarks today. I'm also conscious that I've tried to keep my remarks fairly simple. I do have a lot of information in the back of my mind, and I'm happy to take questions and have a conversation later on. But I thought I'd start with some sort of, I guess, fairly brief overview of what the legal position is in Aotearoa, and take it from there. So today, when we talk about COVID vaccination and children's rights and the issue of consent, if we zone in on the idea of consent, we can go and look at the Care of Children's Act in 2004, and there that talks about children over the age of 16 being able to give consent as if they were an adult. And so the inference might be, or we might then think that children under the age of 15 couldn't consent to vaccination or COVID vaccination. But we really do need to ask a slightly different question, and that's where the law comes in, and that's the question that the law asks. It's not so much, I guess, directly a question of consent and whether a young person can consent. The question is, can a child or anybody else, are they competent? So when is a child or anybody else competent to consent to medical treatment? And the law doesn't give us a defined age there either. And so if we want to try and figure out how to answer this question, then there's two things we can look at. We can look at the Health and Disability Code in New Zealand. And there, the starting point is that everybody is presumed to be competent to give consent, unless the, I guess, the medical professional or the health professional feels that there are reasonable grounds for thinking otherwise. So that's the starting point. It doesn't matter if you're an adult or a young person, everybody is presumed to be competent. We can see this thinking then reflected in the courts, where the courts talk about if they're dealing with questions of competence in children and young people, the question that they ask is that person of sufficient maturity and intelligence? Do they understand the reason, the nature and the implications of the treatment? And we call this in law, at least Gillick competence. It follows on from a case decided in the British House of Lords in the mid-1980s or so, where the House of Lords had to decide whether, I think it was a 15-year-old could give consent to treatment. And that was the formulation that they came up with: sufficient maturity and intelligence. Do they understand the nature and implications of the treatment? So you can see that sort of overlap between what the courts have to say and what our Health and Disability Code has to say. And if we combine them together, we can see that the code and the courts, I guess if you were to summarize it, the question would be asked, does the child, the young person, have full understanding of what's involved in the medical treatment, in this case, vaccination? And the Health and Disability Commissioner and the courts have dealt with these sorts of questions over the years. There's been two complaints made to the Health and Disability Commissioner, and they were about 20 years ago. And one related to the question of whether a 10-year-old could consent, or broader issues than that. But what the Commissioner had to deal with was whether the 10-year-old was competent to give consent or not. And there, in the circumstances, the answer was no. A similar sort of situation arose about in or around a year after that, where the Health and Disability, the Commissioner had to look at a complaint, and part of that was to look at whether a 14-year-old was competent to give consent to a tetanus jab, and the Commissioner found that he was. The issue has arisen in the courts, in the New Zealand courts. So about 6 years ago, Family Court had to deal with a situation where, again, looking at a situation about whether a 15-year-old was competent to give consent to, I think it was meningococcal immunization, and they're using the sort of full understanding, maturity and intelligence standard, the court found that he was. So it's really the question of consent. I suppose maybe the more accurate question is whether a child or young person or anybody else is competent or not. So bearing that in mind, the other part, I suppose the other part of the question is, why do we talk about vaccination as a children's rights issue? So it's moving into, I guess, another aspect of the law. And the reason why we talk about it as a children's rights issue is because in international law, at least, we recognize that health is a human right. So we have a little slide here that sort of spells out the various different ways, the various different aspects of the relationship between health and human rights. So if you think about it, human rights violations can result in ill health. We can say that human rights have a role to make people less vulnerable to ill health. We can say that if we promote human rights, we can do it through health development. So there's quite, I guess, a strong overlap and interrelationship. And this idea is captured in international human rights law that recognizes that health is a human right. Actually, the terminology is a bit more convoluted. We say that everybody's got the right to the highest standard of physical and mental health, but for brevity, I'll just say the right to health. So that right is to be found in a whole series of treaties and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948, and New Zealand is a party to many of these treaties. When we talk about the right to health, it covers a whole lot of issues, but in terms of today's conversation, we can say that the right to health includes the right to access to vaccination and immunization, And a point that I will come back to at the end, the right to health also includes the right to be free from non-consensual medical treatment. And that right is to be balanced with the overall state's obligation to prevent and control disease. So our right to health is our own right to health as individuals, but that puts an obligation on the state to take a variety of steps to, and in this context, to prevent and control disease. So vaccination and immunization would be a part of that. If we look at children in particular, we can see that generally children have a right to health, but their own specific right to health is captured in Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that was adopted in 1989. And 195 countries have accepted this treaty. They've accepted the rights and obligations in this treaty. There's only one that hasn't legally done that through the process of ratification, and that's the United States. So a lot of what I'm talking about now really is in the area of international law. And there's just a point I wanted to make. When we talk about the right to health, I'm talking about it now in the context of international law. So the international law is made up of a series of legal agreements between states. Just because Aotearoa New Zealand has accepted those treaties that contain the right to health, it doesn't mean that it's automatically part of our domestic law. And the right to health is not to be found in our own domestic law. And what we really need to make that happen, the best way to make it happen is to have an active parliament. So a piece of legislation, a statute passed, capturing that international right and making it part of our domestic law. Having said that, when countries and states enter into these treaties, these legal agreements, there is the expectation that they will do so and act in good faith. So that's just, I guess, some of the background of the right to health in the context of human rights law, international human rights law more generally. If we, sorry. Hang on 1 minute, I am having difficulty moving forward with my slide. Yep. If we go back and look more specifically at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there I've got a little image on the side, and it contains lots of different rights that children have, and including that is the right to health. More specifically, there are 4 core principles underpinning children's rights generally, and including the right to health. So these are the things that we need to think about when we are trying to make decisions, pass law, create policy around children's rights, the right to health, and I suppose as part of that, this debate about immunization and vaccination. We need to remember that children, a core principle is that all children have the right to be free from discrimination. They have this right irrespective of their own background or their parents' background, their beliefs or opinions or anything like that. So that's to be found in Article 2 of the Children's Rights Convention. The child has a right, the next core principle is the child's best interests. And according to the convention, that has to be a primary consideration in all decision-making affecting children. So in the context of, say, medical treatment, if there's a conflict between parents and health professionals or health workers, then the child's best interest has to be a primary consideration in resolving those disputes. Related to that, but in a different article in the convention, is the child's right to be heard. So again, in decision-making affecting the child's view, their opinion, they have the right to have that view or opinion heard. And if you think about it, that's got to be central to the decisions around the child's best interest. So you can have maybe health professionals, parents, but you also have to take into account the view of the child. And the final core principle that we need to think about is the child's right to life and the country's obligation to do all that it can to promote that child's survival and development. And that too is related to the child's best interests. So I spent I guess most of my comments are about the rights of children, but we do need to also take into account parents and caregivers and what the relationship there is. If we go back and look at the Children's Convention, we might think that it's all about the rights of the child, but actually if you look at the introductory language and all the way through, the Convention recognises the importance of the family unit and the roles and responsibilities of parents. There is a specific provision in the Convention that seeks to balance parental rights and responsibilities with the child's own developing capacities or evolving capacities to make decisions and important decisions. So that would then sort of feed into decisions around the child's health and well-being. And I just want to make a quick comment that the Convention takes a broader understanding of parents and caregivers here. So it's not just, I guess, a Western nuclear perception of the family, but it acknowledges that families and communities and parents can be understood in terms of local custom. The other key feature, I guess, to remember about the Children's Convention, it was the first human rights treaty to make explicit reference to the rights of the Indigenous child. So these are some of the international legal principles that we can think about in the context of international law and children's rights. If we go back to our own law in Aotearoa, we can look at the Care of Children Act in 2004. And there we see a similarity in the language. We see that the child's best interests and their welfare is paramount, which is a higher standard than a primary consideration. We can see the Act tells us that parents and guardians are responsible for the child's care, development and upbringing at a general level. We also see in the legislation that parents have a role to play in important decisions affecting the child. And one of the things they're talking about there is, I guess, decision making that needs to be undertaken in terms of medical treatment. The parent's role is stronger when the discussion is around non-routine medical treatment, but generally speaking, vaccinations are regarded as routine medical treatment, as I understand it. In terms of a final comment, and I alluded to this earlier, a lot of this conversation is around children's consent to medical treatment. The flip side of that is the young person's right to refuse medical treatment. We can see that in our own domestic legislation because the Bill of Rights Act tells us that everybody, that includes children and young people, have the right to refuse medical treatment. But we will be back to that same sort of question about competency and consent in terms of a refusal of medical treatment. So the same question will be asked, is the young person competent? Do they have a full understanding of what's involved in that decision? And children's views can be overridden when it comes to serious and usually life-threatening situations. And finally, we see this, I guess, mirrored again in international law. As I said a few minutes ago, the right to health does include the right to be free from non-consensual medical treatment. And this point then, I guess, is reflected more generally across international human rights law. So finally, if we think about children and competency and consent, it's that sort of balancing act between the child's rights in these sorts of situations and the roles and responsibilities of parents, and trying to get that balancing act, trying to get all the information together so that a decision can be made. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers today. What a wonderful, excellent presentation. It was comprehensive, detailed, and provided a good overview of both the clinical and the legal-ethical issues that we need to be thinking about as we tackle this new space and as more and more information becomes available. I do want to say for Māori and Pacific communities, keeping on top of this information is key for us to make good decisions. As Professor Breen just highlighted, we have the right to health, we have the right to evidence-based treatment when it is available. And the fact that we have inequities, both in terms of the COVID complications, including mortality, and a lagging when it comes to the vaccination rates, suggest that our rights are not being met, and that we should be fighting for these as leaders in our communities and advocates for good health for Māori and Pacific whānau. I think the other thing that's really clear is that, you know, in terms of our population profile, most of Māori and Pacific populations as a group are our tamariki. And so we should be doing everything possible to keep them safe and healthy. And so I really took that message from Peter around making sure all adults around my tamariki are vaccinated, supporting their teachers, the parents, the caregivers, and of course grandparents, because many of our whānau are living with multiple generations in their homes. So thank you both. I really took on some of those things and will be putting those into practice. We now have time for some questions, and I know Peter's been furiously typing and getting to some of the questions on that question and answer tab, so feel free to go there and have a look at some of his answers, but I might just pull out a couple of key ones. So one of them, Peter, was from Wayne actually, and he wondered about reporting vaccination rates. Is it more useful to be reporting them for the total population, or should we just be reporting for eligible population? Which is going to be more useful, do you think?
Thanks, Matire. Well, I mean, I think at the moment, it's more meaningful for us to be looking at what's an achievable target for, for New Zealand. So I think if we're currently recommending it for 12 and above, then I think that is, what we should have in our sights at this point in time. And I think we need to know both how many people in that age group have received one dose as well as how many have received two, because particularly in younger people, even one dose, but actually for all ages, even one dose provides very valuable protection, particularly against severe disease. And so I think we need to keep both those things in our sights, and I think that's more meaningful, and it's a more meaningful comparison with other countries we'd like to compare ourselves with as well, to be looking at the eligible population rather than the total population. I think you're muted, Matire, sorry.
Sorry, importantly to be reporting by ethnicity as well, just to make sure
absolutely.
that we are
absolutely. And I think the point you made before, Matire, about there being many more younger people in Maori and Pacific households is very important to be mindful of as well.
Great, thank you. Professor Breen, there was a question, but I felt like you probably did address it in one of the last slides, and it's regarding the right to refuse treatment alongside that right to consent. And I guess that may come to the fore, especially as we're seeing some workplaces in particular, so not just with regard to children, but in general, workplaces now requiring people to be vaccinated before they can return to work. Would you like to speak a little bit more about that?
I guess from a human rights perspective, either at the international level and the domestic level, we can look at the right to health, we can look at the right to refuse medical treatment. But with most rights, they're subject to some limitation or restriction. And so I think it was, I alluded to it in one of the slides, that right to be free from medical to refuse medical treatment has to be balanced with, I guess, the state's obligations to prevent and control disease. So, and then if we look at it in the context of our own sort of domestic our Bill of Rights Act, there we can look at it in terms of, yes, the right to refuse medical treatment, the right to be free from medical treatment, but that can also be restricted in terms of the provisions of Section 5. So that limitations can be imposed where it's justifiable. And that's that sort of broader balancing act then about what the state must do to prevent and control disease.
Thank you. Peter, there's a question here from Simon. What are you thinking in terms of potential for booster shots with the vaccine? Do you think immunity will wane over time, and how long will it last?
Yes, well, it's good to have that one come up, Matire. I mean, a lot of people will have been, seeing the data from Israel reported in various, sort of news outlets and so on. And I think there's a few things you've got to remember about Israel. I mean, firstly, they're sort of like a lab for the Pfizer vaccine, which is helpful for New Zealand because we're also obviously relying on that one. But secondly, that they got going very early, but the group they got going with was the oldest and sickest, right? And so the people that they've been seeing drop-offs in protection for, particularly, you know, for more severe disease, are that older, sicker group, right? And so I think it's pretty clear now, and the trouble is it's hard to separate out what's Delta, what is time since your last dose, and what is that you started out behind the 8 ball with a not such a good immune response in the first place. You know, there's those three things happening. And the other thing to remember is that Israel stuck very strictly to that 21 days, you know. And I think the 21 days was understandable in those days when everyone was nervous and we wanted to just get protection as quickly as possible. But I think it's become very clear over the last 6 months or so, as you would expect from first principles with all the other vaccines we use, that actually a longer interval is better. And that's why New Zealand went to 6 weeks. And I think particularly with younger people, that longer interval is much more sensible because they'll already have a great response to the first dose, unlike the old sick ones. And secondly, having that longer interval is, you know, there's emerging evidence that that'll be better in terms of adverse effects as well. So the Israeli data, I think, is showing that in their context with, and particularly amongst that older, sicker group, that, you know, 5 or 6 months later, you are getting breakthroughs. But the important thing is that actually the number of people getting breakthrough infections is still not that high compared to the total number on the population. And I do think, as far as boosters are concerned, we've already seen a recommendation in New Zealand that, as has happened overseas, that people with immune compromise of various kinds should be getting the boosters. And that's not because they're a booster, that's because those people quite possibly didn't respond the first time. So we want to give them a go with the second and the third vaccine to try and maximize the chances that they're going to respond. And as far as what we normally think of as boosters, I think the first cab off the rank should be the old and the sick. So not just that you're over 70, but also that you've got a bunch of other problems, health problems. And there's some recent data from the UK showing exactly that for that severe disease group, the ones that were particularly at risk there was not just people over 65 or over 70, but people who had significant other medical problems. And I think it'll be what was in the rollout in New Zealand, group 3, right? I think it will be the group 3 people that would be wanting to look at first in terms of thinking about boosters.
And then just perhaps following on from that, there's a question from Gerhard regarding natural immunity, which you talked about a little bit in your presentation. Do you think then for children, natural immunity might be better in the long term than the vaccine?
Well, I guess, you know, we don't know for sure, but I think the evidence that's, there's a lot of evidence emerging now to say that people who've recovered from infection and then got a vaccine, that does seem to give the absolutely best, strongest protection. But of course, you know, it's not like chickenpox parties. I don't think any of us, you know, in paediatric practice are saying it's a good idea to send your kid along to get chickenpox. We can see that actually having the vaccine is a much better way to go, even though you do need 2 doses of that one. And I think likewise for COVID, and I think in the New Zealand situation, we've got the privilege of not having a whole lot of infection to worry about. So I think it may well be true that down the track, if you've had a vaccine and then you get infected, you'll be in a lot better shape, and that's what we certainly hope. But I don't think anyone's suggesting that we should get everyone together in rooms and spread COVID around so they can all get it. You know, so it's a matter of having a balance. Yeah.
Thank you. For Professor Breen, there are a couple of sort of practical questions or pragmatic questions here. What to do if a child wants to get the vaccine and their parents don't? How would you address that? And then I think the second question is the potential for children being discriminated against at schools if they weren't to have their vaccine.
So I think with the first question, I would probably bat it back to the the health professionals. So I can talk about the legal aspects. And the law tells us that the child can consent or refuse consent if the health professional believes that they are competent and they have full understanding. And I think that's probably that hard question there is, what if the young person wants one thing and the parents want another thing? The law seems to suggest that it would land between 12 to 15-year-old questions of competence and consent, that it would land with the child. But ideally, we want to be having these conversations, these discussions, and all of the information, as a dialogue, as a conversation between parents and their children. And the law does sort of support that, especially at the international level. That's, that recognition of the relationship between parents' responsibilities and their roles and the rights of children. But I think I mentioned those cases from the Health and Disability Commissioner and the Family Court. They came about because of complaints made by parents that their children were vaccinated without their consent. Actually, some of them were that I think it was another parent had given consent and the second parent complained. But part of that decision was, well, was the child competent to give consent? And you can see sort of the thinking of the commissioner and the courts there. In terms of discrimination, I guess you have to sort of back that one up to the child's right to be free from discrimination. And with our own human rights legislation, that would prohibit discrimination on the basis of, I guess, a physical illness that sits under the umbrella of disability. And again, the child, everybody has the right to be free from discrimination. But I'd cycle back to the comment I made about, I guess, workplaces as well. The right can be limited where there's a balance to be struck between, I guess, public health and the state's obligations to prevent and control disease. So again, for both questions, it's a balancing act.
Thank you. There are so many more questions on the question and answer. So I'm just going to say to people that we will ask our two speakers to address those and make them available to you at some later time, not too long from today, just to help you with your thinking over this next little while. I want to also let you know, somebody asked about having access to the PowerPoints. My understanding is that the PowerPoints won't be sent out as such, but this has been recorded, and so you are able to go back and see the presentation and take notes on those slides if you need to in the future. I want to again thank our wonderful, wonderful speakers today for giving up your time. What has impressed me about being part of the COVID response is the aroha that people have for all of us. As scientists, as legal experts, as clinicians, we all want the best for all of Aotearoa, and I think we have fantastic examples here today with Professor McIntyre, Professor Breen, and also Collin, and all the wonderful work you're doing with my whānau down in South Auckland. Thank you all. I'm going to hand over to Kawati to close us. I do want to acknowledge all the Cookie Islanders here. I was meant to be in Rarotonga next week for a much needed break, but I'm just going to feel the love over the webinar chat today from you. So kia ora ana to all my cookie mates. So thank you, and over to you, Kawati. Oh, you're on mute, Kawati.
I was just going to say if there was anything Collin wanted to say before we close up.
Yeah, just a couple of points. One is to refer, again, thank Matire and our two speakers, to refer people to the A Better Start website. You will find a link to the newsletter, and the reason for that is that you can be informed about our future webinars. So do go to the Better Start website. One message from me from all of this really interesting material is the fact that we really need to encourage and support our whānau, our parents, our grandparents, our uncles, our aunts, the best way to protect the children is to get vaccinated. And I'm on a bandwagon at the moment because I'm a little bit worried about our coverage rates. It's improving, and it's good to see community-led initiatives being ramped up. We should have done this way back in the beginning. But anyhow, reason to be optimistic. But the message from me from the presentation, particularly Peter's, is really to encourage our whānau to get vaccinated. So from me, thank you very much. Kawiti.
Kia ora te whānau. Ei whakamutunga mā tātou, tēnā tātou. Unuhia te uru tapunui, kia wātea, kia mā te ngākau te tinana, te wairua I te rataka tū, koiara rongo whakairia ki runga, tūturo whiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumie, huie, tai ki. Thank you everybody. Have a great day and we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye.